At the end of last year, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimated 4.2 million adults had experienced partner violence or abuse since the age of 15. The ABS also reported that the 4 months into 2024, 33 women in Australia had been murdered at the hands of family violence. And just this past weekend, thousands have rallied across Australia to demand greater action against family and domestic violence. This morning, we are fortunate to have Tim Costello to help lead our discussion on such a challenging social issue. Welcome to Monday Matters. Welcome, Tim. Great to have you back again.
Thank you.
Tim, we're going to get straight into this topic with a fairly pointed question. Where do you think domestic violence comes from?
Ruth Whitman is a mother of 3 boys. She was writing in the New York Times, and she said, the narratives that boys, particularly at an early age, are exposed to is almost always limited to 2 men in combat, one victorious, the other brutally defeated. She says girls will be exposed to stories framed around people, friendships, emotions, internal dramas, and competing emotional needs. Boys encounter worlds of almost zero emotional complexity. She basically is making the point that there is goldfish that we all swim in called culture, and that water for boys and the narratives in which they swim is slightly different for girls. Girls, story by story, are getting the message that other people's feelings are their concern and are their responsibility. Boys are learning that these things don't have much to do with them. And yet, we know that in this culture, it's changing very, very rapidly. And you'll hear men say this with great justification, that we now, in the culture, feel isolated, confused, and conflicted about our very natures. The very qualities that used to define being masculine, strength, aggression, competitiveness, are no longer wanted or needed. And many others who never felt strong or aggressive or competitive to begin with say we're just not sure who we are meant to be. So it strikes me that the bigger macro picture is that as the culture shifts, and I think everyone on this call is very glad that patriarchy has yielded. I grew up watching this in my own home. My dad was a deacon at the church because only men could be church leaders. It was actually Mum and the women who really knew what was going on in the church, not the men. And every deacon's night, Dad would take out a pen and paper, and over dinner, Mum would say, we need more Sunday schools, the youth workers struggling, raise this issue. Dad would write it down and go off and pretend they were his ideas because he was the deacon. In fact, we all knew it was women running the church. And I remember as a kid saying, wow, why don't we let Mum be on the deacons? All this is doing is maintaining a fiction, indeed, teaching women to have to be sometimes manipulative behind, a facade of who's really in charge. So I think we're now got the added insult, and Laura was just talking about this, of social media, of terrifying social media people like Andrew Tate, the British really misogynist, aggressive male model for men. And, he has over 7 million followers. And a lot of them are young boys. I was speaking in Noosa at a Christian college to the staff and a female teacher. she stood up and she said, "Look at me, I'm less than 5 foot tall. Year 10 boys stood over me, calling me bitch, using Andrew Tate's TikTok very words." And she burst into tears. She said, "I just don't know what to do. I feel I can't control this class." So add in social media and some of that aggression, the culture in which the goldfish are swimming, I think is troubled, and we have to think about the culture as well as individual help for men.
Mm. So, Tim, what part can we play as individuals in mitigating domestic violence?
Well, I think we've always known, and churches have often done this best, that though it's largely still women that raise boys, what boys profoundly need, and for 10,000 years, the way they've always learned, is as apprentices to men, going hunting, learning restraint and patience and control of emotions modeled by men. We know, and Steve Biddulph, has written extensively about this, that boys absolutely need to know that they're accepted, that they're noticed. He says that communicates to them affection, literally letting them know they matter. They need teaching from other men, helping them to understand what a good man and a strong man is like. And most of all, they need example. They learn from observing other men. So where churches have been so important, I think, is male models other than dad, and sometimes dads aren't there, for boys in Boys Brigade. It's true in the secular culture, I guess, in scouts and footy teams. Those male models of example, of observing, is incredibly important. Bruce Robinson's a friend of mine. He runs the Fathering Project in Australia, which I think is one of the best things going for men. And essentially, he is saying to all men, in addition to your own kids, maybe grandkids, think of fathering, taking an interest, guiding, showing younger men that they matter. So I think there's some of the things that we can do.
Mm. So, Tim, some people, particularly men, believe that society's attitudes, expectations of men has changed too much. What's your opinion on that?
Part of that pressure is what's called gender equity, and why aren't there more women in leadership on boards as CEOs? And if we have greater gender equity, we won't have as much male violence. The problem with that is twofold. One, a lot of men actually feel that it's no longer merit-based, that somehow if they're up against a woman, they're going to lose just because the fix is in. Now, that might be unfair, but that resentment is strong amongst men. At the back of that resentment, by the way, might be an actual fear that women are smarter than us and more capable. And I think there is a lot of men who are struggling, with that. Once women stayed at home and cared for the kids and we were looked to and had a role, that has all changed. Wives, partners may actually be earning more than us. And that's a big change from 10,000 years of being a man and leaving the woman in the cave nurturing the kids to go out and provide. The second big problem with some of the gender equity stuff, and I was fascinated to see Julia Gillard, our ex-Prime Minister, pick this up, front page of the Australian about a month ago. Gillard said, as a lifelong feminist, I've got to admit that the narratives we feminists have told are failing. They're not helping men. They're not changing men. We have to rethink our narratives. Now, part of that narrative was gender equity. And I support gender equity, but the Nordic paradox, it's called. So Scandinavian Nordic nations have the greatest gender equity in terms of women in positions of leadership right across society. They've done the best. And yet they haven't reduced domestic violence. That's the Nordic paradox. I was fascinated that wide targeted ads on grand final day about family violence trigger potentially more family violence. What we are learning is that if it's a wide gun approach, right, we won't have domestic violence if we just have greater gender equity, is sort of targeting all men and making them feel at times insecure and resentful. It's far better to be much more micro-targeted. Let me give you an example. You'll remember, those who are my age, the Grim Reapers ads when we were combating HIV/AIDS. Those ads that targeted the whole community were disastrous. All they did was make homosexual people identified as the Grim Reaper. They're the ones who are killing us all. What they discovered in beating HIV/AIDS, and Sydney's just declared itself the first major city in the world HIV/AIDS free, is actually you target the group under the radar, very micro-targeted at risk. You don't have mass general advertising, finger-pointing programs. It just doesn't work. It has unintended consequences, like the domestic violence ads, it seems, on a grand final day. So the gender equity idea is our government says if we have gender equity and we're going to get that within a generation, we won't have any domestic violence. It's huge target. It's basically saying to men, you know, your role is under examination, and you might have a few obstacles here put in your way to give women a leg up and suck it up, and then somehow that's going to lead to less domestic violence, rather than going, who's at risk? What are the likely traits? Micro-target that, rather than whole of society, gender equity type targeting. So that's our response.
Now, Tim, you mentioned earlier about that teacher up in Noosa who was height challenged and her year 10 student towering over her. Are men really aware of the level of intimidation that they project to women, do you think?
Look, those of us with wives know the difference in experience. You know, I've never feared walking home in the dark from the station. I'm 6'2" and I'm pretty fit. My wife and girls have always known the fall of footsteps behind them and the fear. We inhabit different worlds, the same world but different worlds. The fears are very different, and I think men have not really understood a lot of those fears. And the Andrew Tate misogynist worldview is very, very attractive to young men, because it basically says women exist for us, which is a pretty clear definition of patriarchy. That's what patriarchy is. Women actually exist to meet our needs. And young boys have been particularly drinking it that well.
Tim, thank you for your insights today. It's always an honour and a privilege to have you as a guest at Monday Matters, but thanks for your time this morning.
That's a pleasure.